happen. We have to really escalate the noise we make so that we'll be heard.
Welcome to Gay USA, where it's never over. I'm Andy Hum.
I'm Ann Northrup. Welcome back, Andy.
Thank you very much. Good to be back.
Thank you to
Chris Cooper
for filling in last week. And on with the news this week. First of all, the White House is backing a ban nationwide on the anti-gay conversion therapy.
The United States military has its first open transgender service member, but is they're not letting him, treating him as a man.
Hillary Clinton's video announcing her candidacy features a gay couple and a lesbian couple.
Republican candidates for president are twisting themselves into knots, justifying their opposition to same-sex marriage and LGBT rights.
If you're paying attention, you know that the Supreme Court will be hearing oral arguments on the marriage cases next week, and there are rallies planned nationwide on Sunday and Monday, the 27th and 28th, I guess that's the following week, when the arguments are going to be held. We will give you information on where to look to find the rally in your area.
Guam looks as if it's going to be the first U.S. territory to allow same-sex marriage.
Activists in Springfield, Missouri rally to protest the repeal of the LGBT rights bill by a narrow popular vote.
You saw all the bad publicity Indiana got, so they're paying $2 million to a PR firm to boost their image for not being a hate state, but then they go ahead and reject an opportunity to protect LGBT rights.
Controversy is again heating up over the Michigan Women's Music Festival and its exclusion, maybe, of trans women.
Martin Sheen is getting ready to play gay again on television.
And Andy, just back from London, will review 9 plays from there, including shows you can see in the U.S. on cinemas via the National Theater Live, such as Ralph Fiennes, thank you. I knew I was pronouncing one part of that wrong.
It rhymes with safe lines.
Ralph Fiennes in Man and Superman. But the exciting thing this week is that we have as our guest our very old friend and colleague, Mike Signorelli, author of a fascinating new book, It's Not Over, Getting Beyond Tolerance, Defeating Homophobia, and Winning True Equality.
Mike's an ACT UP veteran, and of course he does the Michelangelo Signorelli Show on Sirius Radio, and a longtime gay activist. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be back here after a long time.
Long time.
I know.
And you run the, or guest editor of the Gay Voices.
I am editor-at-large of Huffington Post Gay Voices.
Right. Well, we're very happy to see you. We're old, happy colleagues.
We all go way back.
We've done a lot
together. And we're still fighting.
Yes.
Here we are.
Because it's not over.
That's right.
Well, it's not a joke. But I think a lot of our viewers understand that from listening to our conversations. But let's get into your book.
Well, you coined a phrase that I think is really absolutely on point, victory blindness. In part, a comment on the book a couple of years ago called Victory that sort of declared we'd won everything. And as we come to the Supreme Court arguments on marriage, there's a tendency to feel euphoria and optimism and hope. But we do talk about the negative things here every week, and it's not over, and far from finished is certainly your theme here. So what led you to do this at this particular time?
Well, you guys talk about it, and I talk about it, and certainly, you know, it's something that activists out across the country are dealing with in terms of the issues. that they have to battle. But I started to see the celebrations of these enormous victories on marriage, and we have come an enormously long way. It's been great, and people coming out like Tim Cook and other celebrities. It's been a pretty amazing time. But I started seeing these celebrations sort of disconnected from what was happening in people's lives, every day. And it sort of seemed like we were, some activists and others, the media, kind of really blowing up the victories, and like that book, Victory, declaring it pretty much over. And you started to see the words inevitable. It's all inevitable now.
Right.
And I think that part of it is we as a people, for decades, centuries, we're invisible. Then we find our voice, and we go through this horrific period of mass death. And then we get these wins, these few wins, and boom, people are spellbound. And I think it's almost intoxicating. And they put out of their mind the bad stuff that's still out there. And that's where I call it a blindness. They're not seeing the fact that we have no rights all across the country, federally and in 29 states, and people are thrown out of restaurants, thrown out of their jobs. So that's the blindness part. And where I say it's damaging is that when people tell themselves they've won almost everything, and it is, well, inevitable that we're getting the rest, number one, obviously the apathy, people pulling back. But the second thing that happens, and we see it play out, is people saying that now that we've arrived, we should be magnanimous, and don't be so confrontational. Don't push so hard. They're losing, so show America that we're going to be nice to them. That, to me, is a trap that allows the backlash to grow.
Well, you start the book with a actually fascinating dissection of the Brendan Ike Mozilla case, where he was revealed to have made a $1,000 contribution in favor of Prop 8 in California against same-sex marriage.
This was after he was appointed the CEO of the company.
And as a result of the publicity and internal pushing from employees, he resigned. And then everybody said, oh, the activist did this, and how can you be so mean, and blah, blah, blah. And what I particularly liked about your telling of the story was that you went into much greater detail about his background and his actions and his feelings. And it was really a damning case. But I think people still don't fully understand why it's important for us to push against those people.
Well, here was a man, Brendan Ike, who was pretty brilliant. He helped to develop the Firefox browser that millions of people use around the world. He was one of the founders of Mozilla. But he did donate this money to Proposition 8. There was kind of a blow up about it in 2012. And then it died down, so I think the company thought it was okay for them to make him CEO. When they made him CEO, a lot of people who work with the company, developers who donate their time, and Mozilla is a very different kind of company because it's a foundation and people are committed to a transparent web. A lot of people donate their time. And they're saying, well, we're not sure we want to donate our time to a company with, a guy who's running it, who's donated money to Prop 8. Then it came out that, and people were complaining about it, but then it came out that he had donated money to Pat Buchanan, his political campaign when he was running for president. He donated money to an anti-gay Senate candidate in Washington state. He donated money to an anti-gay candidate in California in the same year as Prop 8. And then he wouldn't say that, okay, I've changed my mind, or it was wrong. He wouldn't say that he was, now changed on these issues. He, in fact, was saying in the media that his anti-gay positions could even help the company because they had to make inroads in anti-gay countries like Indonesia. So,
oh boy,
Mozilla really looked at their world of Silicon Valley and the people they have to work with and their users and their developers, and they realized this was a business decision they had to make. They had to ask him for his resignation. This was the free market playing out. It should have been something conservatives support.
Now, you saw a lot of corporations in this current climate about these religious freedom restoration acts where they got on our side. And they said, don't do this to us. But what's being pointed out is that these corporations, although they are pro-gay, they take tables at HRC dinners, they get nice ratings in terms of the way they treat their gay employees, they also elect a lot of candidates around the country who are very conservative, who vote against our rights.
Yes, and you know, I think once again, so much was lost in this discussion we saw play out in the media with Indiana and Arkansas because, as you point out, many of these companies that I think really used it as a great way to, PR-wise, look so pro-gay, they're giving money to the Ted Cruzes and money to the Marco Rubios and the others who are fighting against our rights because they need to lobby for things on Capitol Hill. So I think, you know, corporate America and its support we always have to be careful about. But getting back to the Mozilla case, here we had a sort of a natural thing happening with a company saying, okay, we don't think that we should have this guy as CEO. But when he stepped down, what was jarring to me was many of our own people, LGBT thought leaders, opinion makers, pundits, kind of flinched and felt bad and felt like, and they followed Andrew Sullivan kind of leading the charge that it was wrong and it was censorship for him to step down. And it morphed into, in the right-wing media, that gay groups had called for him to step down, when no gay groups had called for him to step down. This was all within the company. And our disunity allowed the backlash to grow, with Newt Gingrich coming on TV and saying this was the new fascism, Rush Limbaugh saying it was effeminazis.
Well, they're still using that line when they talk about the bakeries and the photographers and the florists. It's all about us forcing them to do something that is against their religious freedom rights. And they're not letting up on this. And I just have echoes of the whole reproductive rights movement in my head and see that they have not gone away on abortion rights, and they're just not backing down. And I wonder, you know, you go to the CPAC convention, the Conservative Political Action Committee, you have callers, I'm sure, of all opinions. You talk to all sides. What is your analysis, first of all, of why they still hate us, why they're fighting this fight, and where they're going from here?
Well, I do go to CPAC and also the Values Voter Summit, where I was able to see them in their laboratories, so to speak, coming up with these religious liberty, quote-unquote, laws, and really kind of, you know, when they have a failure and we think we've won something, they see it as, okay, that didn't work, back to the drawing board. So when Arizona was a big failure for them last year and Jan Brewer vetoed the bill, we thought, okay, we're done with these laws. They went back to the drawing board. They rely on two things, rebranding and reframing and rewriting the laws, and they're now doing it in Louisiana, and luck. Hope that the media, and it's all so fickle, right, will move on to something else, ISIS or whatever. So Arizona died down, but then Mississippi passed one of these laws and nobody paid attention. 3 weeks before the Arkansas and Indiana brouhaha over the religious freedom bills, Arkansas passed a draconian, horrific law that I'm sure you've talked about that rescinded the ability to pass local ordinances, and none of the media paid attention. So, I mean, I certainly see them organizing and relying on that, media not paying attention and reframing the bills, what works and what won't. And what they're looking for, getting back to the reproductive rights issue, they're looking for, and I literally talked to Frank Schubert, the mastermind of Proposition 8, about this at the Values Voter Summit. They're looking for an issue like, and he used this term, like quote-unquote partial birth abortion, which they created that term, right, that they could use to tap into people who are uncomfortable with abortion but might even be pro-choice. But they say, okay, well, that part we don't particularly agree with. Second trimester, even though it's a very rare procedure that's done, you know, all of that gets lost in the media. They use that to chip away at abortion rights. So what they're trying to do is come up with something that the public's uncomfortable with. Well, the polls show that, yes, the public when you ask them, should gays be discriminated against, overwhelmingly say no. But a recent poll from the AP showed that if you ask them, should a baker have the right not to serve a gay wedding, 57% said yes. So this issue, if they can tap into people's discomfort over both homosexuality and religious freedom and paint us as like, okay, you're going too far, then they can buy some time. And your question is, why do they still hate us? You know, the people who are kind of in the rank and file, they're religious zealots, and they're not very well informed, they're uneducated. I think they can be educated. I'm not sure getting big companies on them is the way to do it, because then they see it as big bad companies are against them. They really feel like they are victims and the whole world is out against them.
Well, they're fed this victimology by the Frank Schuberts.
By the leaders.
And you know, I know that we're the scapegoats who are the current fundraising tool for these people, but really, you know, does Frank Schubert really need to spend all his time going after us? Doesn't he have better things to do?
Well, and that's where the leaders, and particularly in the Republican Party and the conservative movement, they see it as a way to keep these uninformed, uneducated, you know, about our issues, religious people actively involved, because they raise money and they vote. So they're the ones who are really even more, you know, devious, because they're coming up with these kind of ways to keep this alive and keep these attacks on us.
But as you say, I mean, it's not just on gay stuff, it's on choice, but it's also against African Americans. Look at the way voting rights have been chipped away at, and look at the nightmare that African Americans are going through with their treatment by the police in this country, which is on, you know, on the news every week.
But maybe it's all a vehicle to get their people elected so that they accomplish their ultimate goal, which is the right-wing rule of the country over issues that are much more important to them, which are about economic control and their own hegemony in that area.
Absolutely. And, you know, getting to the Voting Rights Act being gutted, if there were African Americans 50 years ago who thought it's over, it wasn't over, right? And
right.
I think we stand on the shoulders of the civil rights movement, the women's movement. What I'm trying to do in this book is to say, look at what happened when people weren't paying attention. The backlash blew up. So victory, not exactly.
All right, so you call this a uniquely dangerous moment in our movement. But let's talk about that, but also talk about what it's going to look like when it is over. What would constitute it being over?
I mean, you know, I believe, as you do, that we need full civil rights. We have no federal rights, no federal protections. 29 states are still discriminating. The second chapter of the book is called "We Don't Serve Fags" here, in quotes, because that's what was told to a gay couple in Texas after they had a nice meal at a restaurant. That was nice, I hope you enjoyed it, don't come back, we don't serve fags here. This is happening all across the country, and people are getting thrown out of taxis and thrown out of shops. So yeah, we need federal laws, but for me, when it's over, it will be about having really revolutionized education, I think. And I talk a lot about revolutionizing education, changing how kids are taught in school, and treating LGBT people as people who are human, who have a history, who were contributing to the history of this country. California has started this. The textbooks are rolling out this year. They passed a law mandating education K through 12 of prominent LGBT people in history, but we have a lot of other states to go, and of course we have laws on the books in a lot of states where you're not even allowed to say homosexual. But to me, it will be over when kids aren't sort of coming out of the closet, when kids aren't put in the closet to begin with, whether on gender identity or sexual orientation. You know, we're all assigned this. You wear this color, you play this sport, and then suddenly you realize something about yourself, and you have to come out of a closet. Wouldn't it be great if we didn't put kids in those closets?
If there wasn't an assumption of heterosexuality.
Right.
But you also talk, interestingly, about the need for self-defense training, which is another lesson you've taken from the women's movement, and you talk specifically about talking to the women at Brooklyn Martial Arts.
Yeah. I have a chapter on sort of what can we do about this bullying and these horrific stories of suicide. If anything is an example of it's not over, it's the stories we keep seeing of young people taking their lives, often kids whose parents are even supportive, but they experience the bullying at school. And yes, we need to change the schools. Yes, we need to change the political atmosphere. We need to pass anti-bullying laws. Yes, the It's Not Better campaign was great at telling kids it does get better, right? It's not better. It gets better, right? It's good to tell them it gets better in the future, but it's not better now. That's the problem. So I thought, what could we do about that? One thing was self-empowerment and self-defense that I kind of really was thinking about my own childhood, and then really started connecting with and kind of going back to the women's movement and what women did to really kind of feel better about themselves and beat off, not just physically, but emotionally, people in a hostile world who would take advantage of them. And I talk about self-defense. Brooklyn Women's Martial Arts is about sort of avoiding confrontation. Kevin Jennings, who was the White House anti-bullying czar, openly gay man, he went through a much more aggressive training called model mugging, and he says, you know, nobody is going to bother him on the street, and he tells gay men, and he tells parents, if you're gay supportive, if you have a gay kid, a lesbian child, a transgender kid, put them into a self-defense program. Everything else has to be part of the toolkit. Do not think you're not going to push the schools. You need to push the schools, but you need to teach your kids that they're worthy of defending. He uses that term, and that's about self-empowerment. And then, so that's kind of a back to the basics, something we did that got lost. Why did that approach never connect with our movement the way it did with the women's movement? But then I talk about self-empowerment online because you know, there's some really fascinating research. You know, we hear so much about cyberbullying, and yes, it is something that is a real issue, and it is something that is an animal unto itself. But the research shows that most bullying still happens in school. Most kids are still experiencing that bullying in school, and the internet. Dana Boyd, one researcher I talked to, she interviewed kids, she researched kids, found that the internet for them is, in fact, a way that they can connect with others and find people to connect with. So I kind of put together ways kids can battle that bullying.
And on the bullying front, though, I mean, yes, I think we should all learn self-defense. I don't particularly know it. But we've also got to get, since we're a small minority, we've got to get the bystanders to step up and stop it when they see it happening. That's the majority. The majority of the people who aren't being bullied, they're not doing the bullying, they just need to tell the bullies, no, that doesn't go here.
And that gets back to the revolutionizing education. Because why are the kids bullying, first of all? Why are those kids bullying? What were they taught? Who taught them that, you know, what are they feeling? Because a lot of the bullying, it's coming from men, straight kids who are insecure about their own masculinity. We need to kind of redo how we talk about masculinity with kids, period.
Speaking of how we talk about things, you're not high on the liberal media. The media still puts us up against complete right-wing nutcase bigots anytime we want to talk on television. How are we going to stop this? That's one of the things that you propose.
Yes, I call it the both sides delusion, you know, and it's time to end the debate, not up for debate.
David Rothenberg used to call it, let's get the Nazi view of Passover.
Well, it's pretty amazing, and you're mentioning somebody like David Rothenberg taking us back so many years, that they were doing it back then, and we're still doing it. Here we are, supposedly accepted in society, supposedly victory according to the victory narrative, and they're still bringing the quote-unquote other side on TV. For all of the problems that African Americans face, we have reached a point where you don't bring white supremacists on television to debate whether or not African Americans should have rights? Why are people like Tony Perkins of the Family Research Council or Peter Sprigg, who has called for bringing sodomy laws back and putting people in jail for being gay, why are they on television? And if they are, tell us that they talk about how people should be put in jail for being gay. Instead, they're put on television as sort of respected opposition to gay rights.
Chris Matthews. Oh, I always love talking to you guys.
Yeah, that has to stop, and we need to demand it. And what I think happens all too often is we're so enthralled, again, in this victory blindness with just being on TV, just being portrayed, just having visibility. That's all you hear people talk about. We're so visible, we're so out there. Well, yeah, but what are those visible images like? That's a whole other issue I talk about. But also, why is the opposition, why is the hate put on television?
And I think the mainstream media reporters are still woefully ignorant. They're better than they used to be. They've learned some of the language. They did a decent job on Indiana and Arkansas. But
although in the beginning they were repeating right-wing talking points. Oh, there are 20 laws like this around the country. And the first one was 1993 federal.
Yeah.
They just repeated it.
They're ignorant, and they don't have us on enough, and they think they can discuss it all without any expertise from anyone who really knows what they're talking about. I'm curious about your experience of callers, because we don't have the luxury of having live call-ins on this show yet. It's still a dream. What do you find from your live call-ins these days?
Well, I, just so people know, host a show on Sirius XM. I've been there for 12 years. I started it for 10 years. I was on the LGBT channel, where obviously we had a lot of LGBT listeners, but a lot of heterosexual people, a lot of straight people who would listen in, who were supporters.
A lot of straight people watching this show.
And same thing. And then I moved to Progress, which was kind of a relaunching of the Left channel. And so that was a couple of years ago, and pretty much my LGBT audience came and progressives came, but conservatives also listen, and I'm happy they listen.
Sure.
I want them to listen, and I want them to call and talk to me. One reason why this book really, I think, came together for me and why my eyes were opened up was because of my listeners. As I said earlier, amid all the victories, I would get calls from people whenever somebody was thrown out of a taxi or fired from a job. I would get calls from 20 people who had the same thing happen to them. So I certainly knew that gay people were experiencing the discrimination out there from my callers, but I also know from my conservative callers that the resistance is still there in a very big way, and not the visceral hate that we know and that's visible, but the people who call and say, you know, I support gay rights, but I do believe that a baker or a florist should not have to serve gay people. I do believe that if that's their religion, why do you want them to serve you? This is the line I hear all the time from these people. Why don't you just go to another bakery? And I say, well, in some small towns, there isn't another bakery, but why should I have to go to another bakery? And if you allow it to start with a bakery, it then goes on to everything else. Absolutely. Sometimes it's hard to convince them, because I think there is a streak in this country among people of, you know, whether you want to call it libertarian or whatever, of like, let businesses do their thing. Don't force people to do something they don't want to do. And that's why I think, even though we think of gay marriage as the big slog, when you really think about it, it's not, because it's still about what we do with ourselves. So people can say, okay, you want to get married, but now we're telling businesses, employers, and others, you have to do something that interacts with us. You can't just say we don't have gays here. And that's demanding a bit more.
Well, marriage was always just a first step and a way to establish some parameters of equality or a sense of that. But the game was always much bigger, and I think all our message always is you can be effective in moving the needle by being an activist yourself and not leaving it to the national organizations to get it done.
And one way I talk about, and at the end of the book I have a sort of 7 things people can do collectively and together, real world solutions, but one thing I talk about throughout the book, and it comes up in the end there, is the issue of covering. Kenji Yoshino had written the book Covering back in 2006, way ahead of its time. And it really is sort of looking at how all minority groups and women, once they attain a certain amount of rights, they sort of cover, they try to fit in with, the dominant culture.
Assimilation.
They cover up who they are. And it is very limiting. It can get you some rights, but it doesn't chip away at that implicit bias, that homophobia that's really there. And an example, is when we look at Modern Family or any of these TV shows, there's no chemistry between these people, there's no sex between these people. They're covered images, they're covering. They're made palatable to straight people, and ultimately they don't challenge homophobia. Michael Sam, when he came out, that was a great thing, and he could have just assimilated in and been the first gay football player, but he decided not to cover. He kissed his boyfriend in front of America, and that pressed a lot of buttons. That was a threat to a lot of people, and it showed how far we have to go. That wasn't covering. And
it may also have been the enthusiasm with which he kissed his boyfriend.
But the straight guys
he was
kissed
pretty
their
happy.
wives pretty
Wouldn't you be pretty happy if you got drafted?
I thought that was a pretty enthusiastic kiss.
But the straight guys do that with their wives.
Sure.
And America needs to see it. And
maybe
if they
Al
don't
Gore and Tipper at that convention. No one liked that much either.
But the point is, it's not over. And you can read all about it in Mike Signorelli's new book, It's Not Over, Getting Beyond Tolerance, Defeating Homophobia, and Winning True Equality. And you can read about the book at itsnotoverthebook.org.
.com.
.com.
It's notoverthebook.com.
Really
easy.
Perfect.
That's what I have on the screen.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. So
Happy
great
to
to
get
see
you
both
here.
of you, and thanks for all the
Nice
work
to
you
see
do.
you.
And
all the work
ditto.
we've done together, and we'll continue to.
Onward and upward.
Have
That's
fun
right.
on the road.
Thank you.
And we'll hope to get you back here soon.
Absolutely. I
It's
can't
our
wait to come back.
conflicting broadcast schedule.
I can't wait.
Yeah.
Yes.
Take care.
All right, we're going to move on to the rest of the news. We'll let you slide out. Thank you. All right, news. Well, you have at the top of the list here the White House on conversion therapy.
I think when the White House does things, it's significant.
Oh, yeah,
and,
that was pretty big.
And they did come out against conversion. It's the anti-gay conversion therapy that when it's offered to minors, that it shouldn't be offered to minors. Some states have banned it. New York, for instance, has not.
Well, they were forced to respond to a petition. When you start a petition to the White House, if you get over 100,000 people signed onto your petition, they are forced to respond by their own policy. So they did respond, and they said that conversion therapy is not effective or appropriate, and it causes harm, which was a good thing to say. And the Surgeon General said it too.
Yes. We had some activity out in Springfield, Missouri this week. You talked about the fact that we lost this referendum there, horrible thing, where they voted on repealing their LGBT rights law, but we have a picture there. Over 1,000 people turned out in Springfield, Missouri for a big rally, and that's a lot of people to get there. There they are.
Wow, yes.
You know.
Well, I was very struck when the law was repealed, when the vote happened. Immediately, LGBT activists and allies were interviewed, and they were fairly non-excited about it. They said, well, we're not entirely surprised. This is a Bible-Belt community. The Assemblies of God churches worked very hard on this and told a lot of lies and put up some ugly videos on YouTube. And we're going to keep working on this, and we expect to keep working on it.
Should we talk about what's happening with legislation around the country, since this is the legislative season?
I think since we mentioned Missouri, we should go back to Indiana first, which where the legislature was asked to, in the wake of the debacle there, to pass a statewide sexual orientation, gender identity, non-discrimination bill, and the Republicans have refused.
Well, it was offered as an amendment to another bill, and they defeated it 66-24, saying it's not appropriate for this bill. But let's see you deal with it and take it up on its own. Instead of spending $2 million in public relations funds to burnish the image of your state, which is now regarded widely as a hate state. Now, Freedom to Indiana says, look, maybe we're not going to win at the state level. We're going to focus on the localities, the cities, and we're going to try to pass these things. There are a lot of good people in Indiana.
Exactly. And in good news from Oklahoma, where they defeated all the anti-LGBT bills that were on the docket there, and did it with a bipartisan effort with support from both sides. They had a lot of ugly bills there that had been proposed, but none of them have been passed.
And progress in Florida, where they are, the legislature has voted to actually repeal the unconstitutional law against gay adoption. It's not been enforceable, but we're not sure what the governor's going to do. Well, the court had gotten rid of it, but they actually put a bill in to repeal it.
Yes. Now, there was a proposal as part of all this to enact a new prohibition on gay adoption, basically by putting in a religious freedom clause that would allow private adoption agencies as well as government adoption agencies to exercise some religious option of not letting anyone they didn't like adopt, and with the public funding or whatever. And the House twice passed this bill, and the Senate twice defeated it and took it out and said, no, we're not going to accept that clause. So the bill went through as just the repeal of the old non-operative law. And yes, the question is, will the governor sign it now? Governor Rick Scott, who is a Republican and quite conservative. And I'm not sure whether they can override his veto if he does veto it.
But Governor Bobby Jindal of Louisiana, also very, very conservative, and said passing a Religious Freedom Act is one of his top 3 priorities, but he's getting a lot of pushback from the legislature because they don't want to kill the tourist business in New Orleans, et cetera. And so that it may not happen there.
Well, they're rewriting it because one of the things that became clear was that they were trying to allow the state, even if the Supreme Court legalizes same-sex marriage nationally, not to recognize same-sex legally married couples and give them equal benefits or anything, and people were freaking out a little about that. So they're rewriting the bill to try to get rid of that, but it's still a heinous bill, so we'll see what happens with it.
But you know, in Arkansas, Governor Asa Hutchinson sees no need for an executive order banning discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation.
Bring Mike back to tell us about more callers to his radio station talking about all the ways they're discriminated against. In Missouri, the legislature is moving forward on a possible statewide non-discrimination bill, in spite, maybe because of the repeal of the law in Springfield.
Going back to Arkansas for a second, in Jonesboro, they rejected an LGBT protections bill just for city employees.
Interesting development in the U.S. Congress. This week they got introduced a non-binding resolution in the House that would put them on record as supporting non-discrimination for sexual orientation or gender identity. It's not a law. It wouldn't have any force. It would simply be an opinion from the House. And the idea is that this is sort of a step on the way to an actual law, which Representative Cicilline from Rhode Island is going to propose probably in June, in Pride Month. He'll introduce something. There's a group of people working on it, and this is a writing of a civil rights bill that we've been asking for. Last year, we objected to the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, which had been just totally watered down with a very broad religious exemption, which we now understand is not a good idea. So we got that killed as an idea, and what we said was we need a comprehensive civil rights bill that doesn't have an overbroad religious exemption, and so they're working on it. But first they're going to try to pass this non-binding resolution. So it'll be very interesting to see how far they get with that.
Going back to conversion therapy for a second, in New Jersey, the Third Circuit federal court turned back another challenge to that, to New Jersey's ban on that.
In other political news, of course, what everyone's focusing on is the announcement of various presidential candidacies. On the Democratic side, there is one main candidate stepping into the ring.
Who might that be?
That would be Hillary Clinton. I have to say, call me a sap, but for 2.5 minutes, or 3, whatever the length of that video, I was impressed by the expertise of the video. I thought it was a very well-produced video.
What do you expect? She's got an out-gay campaign manager, the first out-gay campaign manager for a major campaign.
Robbie Mook, 35 years old, worked for her in 2008. And worked for Terry McAuliffe as his campaign manager.
Now, of course, George Bush had a closet case. Ken Mailman working for him, who's out of the closet now.
That's true. Well, Hillary is being very out and had in her video 2 men who said that they were getting married and a shot of what appears to be a lesbian couple.
The gay men invited Hillary and Bill to their wedding.
After they saw themselves in the video. But then people said, well, but Hillary is in support of same-sex marriage, but she's always said it should be a state-by-state thing, and she's never really weighed in on a national law. And what does she think of the Supreme Court?
She weighed in today.
Yes, she did. She didn't let that rest. Her campaign said, oh, yes, she wants the Supreme Court to legalize same-sex marriage. So she's on board. Okay. But, you know, we continue to have some concerns about Hillary.
And Russia had concerns about her video because they put an over 18 warning label on it if you wanted to watch it in Russia.
That was hilarious. Actually, it was sad. But the Republican candidates are just right down the line in their continuing opposition to same-sex marriage, their support for these religious freedom laws.
Here's going to try to be my policy on this show.
Okay.
If a Republican says something pro-gay, it's news. Right now, none of them support LGBT rights, and none of them support same-sex marriage.
It's actually quite shocking. And one thing I noted while you were away, someone told me that Karl Rove is working on a strategy for next year for these elections that mirrors the Bush strategy in 2004, where they put a lot of these anti-marriage ballot measures there, and that he's going to come up with some religious freedom thing that's going to draw out conservative voters and give the Republican a chance to win. That's scary business. We'll see whether he can pull it off, because we've been fighting this in the legislatures, but if it gets to the voters, as we discussed with this confusion over what these laws really mean.
And we've been fighting for out-trans service in the U.S. military, because it's not allowed right now. But Sergeant Shane Ortega, 28, is being allowed to stay in because they did a sort of a workup on him, and he's not sick, basically.
He's a trans man.
I mean,
look
take a
that.
Look. But
he's an Army helicopter crew chief. He has been treated. He's still being treated as a woman.
He has to put on dress women's clothes when, you know, because if you're in your fatigues, what the hell's the difference? But when he's in dress uniform, they make him put on a women's uniform because he's still classified as a woman.
So they're trying to decide
but they're
whether
letting him serve.
For the moment, they still might decide to discharge him. There's no law against transgender service. There are rules, but they can change the rules, and they can interpret the rules, and they can do whatever they want. There is no actual law against transgender service. Meanwhile, in California, Attorney General Kamala Harris has done something we thought was a little newsworthy.
She's very liberal, and she's running for the U.S. Senate out there.
But she has announced that she is opposed to a transgender surgery being offered to a prison inmate, Michelle Norworthy.
Well, it's a federal judge's order.
Yes. and Kamala Harris is opposing it and saying she's getting hormones, she doesn't need immediate surgery. Is this a campaign move on her part? What is her analysis of this? And in Fullbrook, California, sad story of Taylor I have it as, I can't read my own writing, Alacama, a teenage transgender girl, 16, committed suicide. He had been forced to go back to, had gone back to dressing as a boy because she'd been bullied so horrendously at school, and finally committed suicide. In Lakeland, Florida, an eye clinic has settled a case brought by a former employee who is a transgender woman. The EEOC had filed suit against the eye clinic, charging them with discrimination when they harassed her and fired her. And the case has now been settled with a $150,000 payment to the trans woman and a promise of new policies and training by the eye clinic.
But in in Orange County, Florida, at the Aloma Methodist Daycare Center, Jacqueline Pfeiffer and her partner Kelly Bardler were fired when their relationship was discovered. They were given the option to change their lifestyle, and they're suing. But this is a church that had a resolution in 2008 against discrimination against gays. Now,
Wow.
They could make a case that it's stuff at the office or something like that, but they wouldn't tell people to change their lifestyle.
Weird. And the National Center for Lesbian Rights is suing the Tower Loan Company because they fired a transgender employee, Tristan Broussard.
We have a picture
of Tristan. The EEOC had decided a case in his favor, but Tower Loan said that he had to dress as a female and be treated as a female.
Yeah. I mean, take a look at him.
Yeah.
By the way, you mentioned the Sally Ride statue being proposed by California. Well, the Senate passed it in California to make that one of their 2 statues in the U.S. Capitol.
Very moving. In a sad story out of Goldsboro, North Carolina, a Wayne Community College student was fired from his work-study job, and he went back to the office and shot and killed his supervisor, who was a gay man.
And his mother's the alleged perpetrator's mother's going around saying, he came on to my son. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that comes out. They're trying a gay panic defense there.
Yes.
You take a look at this guy. I don't know. Well, we don't have a picture of him.
And a really weird and bad story from North Miami, where a Hungarian guy, Andras Voss, has been convicted of sex trafficking. He brought in a lot of young men, I guess, from other countries, and put them up in apartments in Miami and New York, took their papers away from them, threatened their families, and forced them to have a lot of sex with Johns and online. And
reminds me of the movie Eastern Boys a little.
Yeah.
Yes. In New York City, a trans woman at the Monster Bar in Sheridan Square says she was assaulted by the bouncer for using a unisex restroom at a lesbian party night. No patrons intervened on her behalf.
In Des Moines, Iowa, Dowling Catholic High School has fired a gay teacher, Tyler McCubbin, for being too out. He was well,
they discovered he was in a relationship.
Yes, he was engaged. Students, parents,
alumni,
all stood up for him, but
they walked out of school.
It's an endless story.
And in Utah, out-gay Senator Jim Dukakis is running for mayor of Salt Lake City, and former lawmaker Jackie Biskupski is also running. So we're going to have some out-gay candidates for mayor of Salt Lake City, Utah.
And the 25-year fight over trans attendance at the Michigan Women's Music Festival is getting uglier this week. Last year, national organizations were asked to sign on to a letter to the festival objecting to their ongoing exclusion of trans women. The festival says they don't actually exclude trans women, but they have an intention that the festival be for women-born women. It's a very sad fight, and now the National Center for Lesbian Rights and the National LGBTQ Task Force have said they're taking their names off the letter because it's become too confrontational, and there are too many people who have been hurt on both sides, and they want to go back to trying to negotiate it and see if they can work it out. People, the trans community now, a lot of trans women are upset at the organizations for pulling off the letter. It's a mess.
We're going to have to trip through the news if we're going to get through this. We've got very little. Let's go quickly. Well, the big news is from Guam, where they seem on the verge of being the first U.S. territory to have same-sex marriage. A little dispute among the hierarchy there, but it's in the Ninth Circuit, and it ought to happen.
As gay teachers are being fired all over by Catholic high schools, a homophobic teacher at a Catholic high school in Metuchen, New Jersey, has been reinstated. Her free speech homophobic rights have been upheld. If
you want to go to a marriage equality rally in your area on April 27th or 28th, which is when the actual arguments are before the Supreme Court, go to uniteformarriage.org, uniteformarriage.org, and see if there's one going on in your area, or start one.
In New York, it'll be on April 27th, 6 p.m., Times Square.
Puerto Rico, the First Circuit is not going to schedule arguments about the marriage case there. They're going to wait until the Supreme Court decides.
And the National Organization for Marriage is going to have another fruitless march for marriage in D.C. a few days before the Supreme Court arguments. A few other things, but nothing crucial. Let's get to our president in Jamaica. He went there for a Summit of the Americas meeting. Actually, that was in Panama. He was in Jamaica first. And he gave a speech to students at a town hall, and he spoke up for LGBT rights, and it was quite wonderful.
Stay with it.
You're more eager for progress that comes not by holding down any segment of society, but by holding up the rights of every human being, regardless of what we look like or how we pray or who we love. You care less about the world as it has been and more about the world as it should be and can be. And unlike any other time in our history, the technology at your disposal means that you don't have to wait for the change that you're looking for. You have the freedom to create it in your own powerful and disruptive ways. Many of you already have, whether by starting your own enterprises or by helping others start theirs. And I'm going to just single out two remarkable young leaders who are here today because I think they're an example of what is possible, even in the most difficult of circumstances. So Angeline Jackson is here today. Is Angeline? Where is Angeline? There she is, right there. So several years ago, when Angeline was 19, she and a friend were kidnapped, held at gunpoint, sexually assaulted. And as a woman and as a lesbian, justice and society were not always on her side. But instead of remaining silent, she chose to speak out and started her own organization to advocate for women like her, get them treatment and get them justice and push back against stereotypes and give them some sense of their own power. And she became a global activist. But more than anything, she cares about her Jamaica and making it a place where everybody, no matter their color or their class or their sexual orientation, can live in equality and opportunity. That's the power of one person, what they can do.
Not everybody was applauding, but nobody booed.
In Nicaragua, they have a new family code, no same-sex marriage, no civil unions, no adoptions, but the LGBT activists who are living there will challenge its constitutionality.
The president of Chile signed the civil union law. Big step there.
Applies to both gay and straight couples. In Egypt, a court ruled that it's okay for Egypt to bar a gay man from coming into the country.
And Peru, they had a big march for equality because the bill to recognize civil unions was rejected. And a big TV star there, Rodrigo Gonzalez, we have a picture of him, came out of the closet.
He's on the left, his boyfriend is on the right. The Alan Turing notebook was sold, but the news coverage I saw basically just said, oh, he was arrested for gross indecency. Nothing about a pardon or anything. Yeah. ugly. In Russia, they've discovered that Siri, the Apple phone,
I know.
In Russian makes rude remarks about gay people.
Siri is apparently rude to everybody.
It may or may not have been fixed. And in Kyrgyzstan, the LGBTQ center was attacked with bottle bombs. No one was hurt, and more Irish leaders are coming out for marriage referendum May 22nd.
In AIDS news, Indiana, the House there passed needle exchange program for high-risk counties. They have a big outbreak, and they're looking at counties with high hepatitis C rates because that correlates with the HIV, apparently.
In the District of Columbia, the city council there is going to consider passing an LGBT cultural competency Continuing Education Amendment Act of 2015. It would require all healthcare professionals, doctors, mental health professionals to receive 2 credits of education on LGBT people and issues. That would be fantastic.
Yes.
That should be nationally. And the the AIDS Healthcare Foundation's Michael Weinstein is fighting back against the charges that they screwed the government.
Yes.
Who knows? Entertainment news.
Barry Manilow married his partner, Gary Keefe, last year at a private ceremony.
Yeah.
Is he out? I guess he is now.
Well, sort of. I've been watching the Clay Aiken show
Yes.
on the Esquire network. He's not the nicest guy, although I'm warming up to him a little. And there's a new trans show on Discovery Life, New Girls on the Block, and we're all just buckling up for the Diane Sawyer interview with Bruce Jenner on April 24th.
And Netflix has a new series called Grace and Frankie, where Martin Sheen and Sam Waterston leave their wives for each other. Martin Sheen played gay back in the 70s on a TV show.
New play you may want to catch, Emmett, Down in My Heart, about Emmett Till by our friend Claire Koss, partner Blanche Wiesen-Cook, about 1955 Mississippi, playing for the next month on weekends at the Castillo Theater on West 42nd Street.
But I don't think you want to see Gigi.
No.
I mean, they've done a Disneyfied version of a musical about a prostitute. You know, it's
with Vanessa Hudgens, an old Disney star.
Well, the kids who love her are there.
Okay, now you have 9 London plays to review.
I didn't see anything in London I didn't like this time, and that's terrific.
That's nice.
But I want to tell you about the things that you can see on NT Live. Go to ntlive.com. The National Theater transmits these to cinemas around the country, and these are coming up now.
Man and Superman?
By Bernard Shaw. This is with Ralph Fiennes in an incandescent performance. It's a 100-year-old play, and it's just as provocative and relevant today.
The Hard Problem?
Tom Stoppard's new play about the nature of consciousness. It's not his best, but even not his best is good on an off day.
I don't know. I walked out of one of his.
No, this one is worthwhile, and that'll be on NT Live.
Behind the Beautiful Forevers?
By David Hare, also on NT Live. It's based on Catherine Boo's journalism in a Mumbai slum, and it's very challenging to watch. It's sort of out Dickens, but it doesn't sentimentalize the poor, and I think it's an important confrontation with reality.
If we're going too fast, write to andyhum@aol.com and he'll give you the link to his written reviews.
Or go to gaycitynews.com after they're posted on April 18th, as I'm told.
Dead Sheep.
This is, there you see Margaret Thatcher played by a man, but not campily. This is the guy who used to do her voice on Spitting Image, where he used to do the voice of the puppet on that. But it's about Geoffrey Howe, and that's James Wilby on the left there. He plays Geoffrey Howe, who was the number 2 to Thatcher, who eventually brought her down. And he plays it with great dignity.
26 seconds.
Okay.
Our American cousin.
Lincoln was lucky not to have had to sit through this entire play 150 years ago.
Rules for Living.
It's about the family Christmas dinner, and it will make yours seem wonderful. It's a good play, though.
After Electra.
Another play about a parent who wants to commit suicide, telling the whole family. But this one is a comedy.
Dara.
A Pakistani play about the Mughal princes in the 17th century. I went because Peter Tatchell made me, and it was the most moving speech about religious tolerance I've ever heard in my life.
And Gypsy.
I'm not supposed to review it because it was in previews. It's wonderful with Imelda Staunton.
People Magazine, Rock Hudson's friends and lovers speak about him 30 years after his death, and we'll be back next week.